We're coming to part 3 of a 3-part series on the subject of death, heaven, hell, what happens when we die, and so on. During program 1, the first program, we talked about a definition of death, which when we arrive at a definition of death, we really have arrived also at a definition of life, the meaning of life. We've also talked a little bit in part 2, program number 2, about what happens when you die, what happens in the first few moments, what is the judgment like, and so on and so forth, the toll houses. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about the Orthodox traditions around death, why the Orthodox Church does the things that they do around the death of one of its members, and so on and so forth. What I'm talking about is traditional Christianity. I'm talking about something that has been done for hundreds and hundreds of years by many, many people, and only recently has been abandoned by some Christian churches. When a person dies, usually the priest is called to come to the place where the person has died, depending on where that is, and there are particular prayers to offer at that point. The prayers are for the person's soul, for the person's comfort during that time. We pray these prayers because we are aware that the person doesn't cease to exist because the body stops working. When the body dies, the soul continues to live. And we know from Christian history, we know from various sources that the soul continues to hover around the body. The soul continues to be around the physical body even right after death. So I go and I'll pray particular prayers. The particular prayers are speaking to God, but they are also very aware that the person who I am praying for, the person who is lying there, who is recently deceased, is still with us, is still around, can still hear me speaking. Okay. Now, in the traditionally, there was not a great amount of time between a person's death and a person's burial. We don't practice cremation in the Orthodox Church. Cremation was introduced to American society in the 1800s by the New England Transcendentalists as a way of denying the bodily resurrection. They said that they could deny that we are resurrected from the dead by completely destroying their bodies. It's a kind of an odd thing to think, but now this has continued to go on and on and on through the years, almost sometimes as a way of people trying to avoid the expense of a funeral, or the expense of a burial in this case. Anyway, traditionally, a person was not, there wasn't a great deal of time between the time a person died and the time a person was buried. And so the person would die, the family and friends would be called, they would arrive quickly, the prayer would be said, the person would be buried, the funeral would be sung, and so on, the person would be buried. And then always on the third day after the death, particular prayers are prayed in the Orthodox Church. They're prayers for the third day after death. Now, as it turns out nowadays, very often the funeral is on the third day after they die, or even later than that in some cases. I've had times when people have died and it's been a week until the funeral because people are flying in from all over the world to come to the funeral. But I want to read a little bit about the 3 days waiting, the 3-day memorial from a book called The Soul After Death by Father Seraphim Rose. For the course of 2 days, the soul enjoys relative freedom and can visit places on earth which were dear to it, but on the third day it moves to other spheres. Let me read the explanation of that. Here Archbishop John simply repeats the teaching known to the church since the 4th century. Father Seraphim is writing about a particular book written by St. John Maximovich. When the angel who accompanied St. Macarius of Alexandria in the desert told him, in explaining the church's commemoration of the dead on the 3rd day after death, when an offering is made in church on the 3rd day, the soul of the departed receives from its guardian angel relief from the sorrow it feels as a result of the separation from the body. So there is a passage of time that occurs after a person dies, a 3 days passage of time, which seems to be almost given in order to allow the soul to acclimate itself to the fact that it has died. All right? In the course of 2 days, oh, well, the soul hasn't died, but the person, the body has died. In the course of the 2 days, the soul is permitted to roam the earth wherever it wills in the company of the angels that are with it. Therefore, the soul, loving the body, sometimes wanders about the house in which the body had been laid and spends 2 days like a bird seeking its nest. But the virtuous soul goes to those places which it was wont to do good deeds. On the 3rd day, he who himself rose from the dead on the 3rd day commands the Christian soul, in imitation of his resurrection, to ascend to the heavens and worship the God of all. So what Father Seraphim is telling us here via St. John Maximovich, who's also referring to St. Macarius of Alexandria in the 4th century, what we're being told here is that for 3 days the soul is wandering around where it used to live, in the place it used to live, in the church, in the places that are dear to it, near the places where it has done good deeds, and so on and so forth. This is something that has been shown throughout history. Whenever a person dies and comes back to life, they can describe that kind of thing. The soul doesn't instantly go someplace, but seems to hover around the body, and then as time goes on, gain more and more movement. Well, I can see it's raining a little harder now. We moved the camera underneath the porch there, but I think I'm going to have to move myself under there as well. Well, oftentimes we don't actually have a separate service for the 3-day prayers. We do on some occasions, but not on all occasions. But for almost everyone who dies in the Orthodox Church, we have a 40-day memorial. The 40-day memorial is much more widely sort of held, and part of the reason I think that it is because it's at the 40-day part, it's at the 40-day place when really you're beginning to notice the grief that you're suffering over the loss of whoever it is has died. At the beginning, when the person first dies, there is a kind of a grief, but it really hasn't settled in. And then later on, it begins to, as you begin to accept the fact that the person's gone, you begin to notice more and more things in your life. You do something and that person was there, and you notice that they're not, and so on. This goes on and on for a while, and then we come to the 40-day memorial. It's not only a psychological thing. We don't just have a 40-day memorial because that's the point at which you come to accept the person's that the person is gone, but there's another reason as well. Listen, first of all, to the words of St. John Maximovich. Then, having successfully passed through the toll houses and bowed down before God, the soul for the course of 37 more days, this is 3 plus 37 equals the 40, visits the heavenly habitations and the abysses of hell, not knowing yet where it will remain, and only on the 40th day is its place appointed unto the resurrection from the dead, or the resurrection of the dead. All right, So what's happening is at this point, the soul is becoming familiar with all that the afterlife has. It isn't as if you die and immediately go to heaven and you are completely unaware of what hell is like, or just the opposite way around. But you are experiencing all that the afterworld has. You're getting almost a tour of the afterlife in a way of putting it. And so then after that point, after that 40th day, then the soul is sent to the place where it is going to spend eternity. So this is a question sometimes in the church. People want to have the 40-day memorial on a weekend, of course, because they want to make it when the most people are able to come to church. And there's a question people have. What if the weekend falls after the 40 days, or do we do it on the weekend before the 40 days? Well, if you look at what happens, and the 40th day, the soul is ushered to the place where it's going to be eternally. If you want to pray for the soul while it's still undergoing the experience leading up to the 40 days, you're going to pray on the Sunday before the 40th day. You're going to pray on the nearest Sunday before the 40 days occur, and then your prayers are going to be effective toward helping that person in their experience. I'm going to read about what Father Seraphim writes in response to St. John's writing. It's certainly not strange that the soul, having passed through the toll houses and finished for good with earthly things, should then be introduced to the truly other world, in one part of which it will spend eternity. According to the revelation of the angel to St. Macarius of Alexandria, the Church's special commemoration of the departed on the 9th day after death, apart from the general symbolism of the 9 ranks of angels, occurs because up till then the soul is shown the beauties of paradise. And only after this, for the remainder of the 40 days, is it shown the torments and horrors of hell, before being assigned on the 40th day to the place where it will await the resurrection of all at the last judgment. These numbers, once again, constitute a general rule, or a model, of after-death reality, and undoubtedly not all the departed complete their course precisely according to that rule. So in other words, it's not exactly 40 days, not precisely counting out 24-hour days and so on. We do know that Theodora, in fact, completed her tour of hell just on the 40th day as time is measured on earth. And this is a story from one of the saints of the church. So we hear in Father Seraphim and in Saint John Maximovich, also quoting to us from Saint Macarius, that there is a pattern to what happens after a person dies. There is the judgment. There is a 3-day sort of stay on earth. Then there is a 40-day or 40 days after death. There is this tour of the afterlife, and then the judgment is made where the soul is going to spend eternity. Well, now, I think I'd like to end this series by going a little bit to the funeral service itself. Funeral service in an Orthodox church is a beautiful thing. It is mostly a sung service, mostly given to us in order for us to reflect on the nature of death. The service, of course, is not conducted for the sake of the person who has died, but the service is conducted for the sake of the people who are living, for the sake of the people who have gathered. And although to some extent the service is used as a way to comfort those who miss the person who has died, who are grieving for that person, at the same time also, the Orthodox funeral service is used as a way for us to meditate on our own death, meditate on the fact that there will be a day when we're going to be the person laying in the casket at the front of the church. And what will that be like for us? What will happen then? There's another part of the Orthodox funeral service that I've had a number of people comment on, and that is the fact that we don't have any eulogies. There's a couple of reasons that we don't have eulogies. We just simply have funeral sermons, which are normally commentaries on the gospel or the epistle that's read at the time. Couple of reasons why we don't do eulogies. First of all, there is some degree to which a person who has just died is going to desire repentance, especially as we've talked a little bit about the toll houses, a little bit about the assaults of demons that occur after a person dies. A person does not want to dwell on the things in their life that led them away from God, those things in their life that perhaps gave them pride and made them great in this world. And so consequently, if that person is present there, if the person's soul is present at a funeral, and everybody's standing up in the church and saying, this person was so wonderful, the person was so great, you know, he could run faster than anything, she was more beautiful than anything, or whatever the case may be, that's not what the person wants to hear. The person wants to hear about repentance, about turning to God, about turning their back on those things that tempted them in this world. And so a eulogy given at a funeral is destructive and harmful to the soul of the person whose funeral it is. Secondly, there's another reason why we don't have a eulogy at a funeral, and the reason for that has to do with those of us who are in the church, who are there to commemorate the person who has died. That is that in any eulogy, there is non-truth spoken. We don't want that to be the case. We don't want to stand up and say the person was wonderful when they really weren't wonderful. But what happens naturally is that we accentuate a person's good points and we sort of deny their bad points. We don't talk about their bad points. Only once have I been to a funeral where people stood up and said how terrible the person was who had died. And I certainly wouldn't want to have that happen at my funeral, and I know that you wouldn't want to have it happen at yours either. But we stand up and we say how wonderful the person was, and we forget about those other things. This is an untruth for all of us. We do good things and we do bad things. We do things that are selfless and we do things that are selfish. We do things that are altruistic and we do things that are greedy, and so on and so forth. And so for people to stand up and say, now we're going to talk about this person's life, but we're only going to talk about the good, unselfish, altruistic things they've done, you're not talking about the person's life. You're only talking about part of their life. And so in that way, it is an untruth. It is a lie of omission in a way. And so we don't do that in the church. If people want to give eulogies, it's my own practice that they can give eulogies either in the funeral home the night before, if there is something in the funeral home, or more particularly, there's usually a meal after the funeral is over, and it's an appropriate time to stand up and remember the person. But let's look at a couple of the hymns that are sung in the church. These are hymns that sometimes people who go to Orthodox churches where they don't sing in English, they don't get the full impact of what's happening or what's being said. I've had experiences where I've stood up in the church and I'm singing a particular hymn, and somebody, an older person, will come up to me and say, how could you say those things? I've been to many, many funerals and I've never heard anything like that. Well, maybe it's because you didn't understand what was being sung. But here is what's being sung. This is from part of the canon of St. John of Damascus. It's sung toward the end of every funeral. This is the second part. Woe is me! What manner of ordeal doth the soul endure when it is parted from the body? Woe is me! How many then are its tears, and there is none to show compassion? Turning its eyes to the angel, it supplicates in vain. Stretching out its hands to men, it findeth none to help. Wherefore, my beloved brethren, meditating on the brevity of our life, let us beseech Christ rest for him who hath departed hence, and for our souls the great mercy. What is this? This is describing almost a terrible atmosphere. You die and you're longing. You stretch out your hands to the angels. They don't respond. You stretch out your hands to the people around you. They don't respond. And you're caught in this sort of terrible kind of time. Is that the kind of thing that we want to think about when we're sitting in church and our father, our mother, our brother, our friend is sitting up there, is laying up there in a casket in the front of the church? The answer is yes, of course it's what we want to think about. We want to think about it because that's what happens. And we hope that that person thought about it before they died. And certainly we want to consider it before our time comes. I want to read from the last verse of this particular hymn. The 8th verse. I weep and I wail when I think upon death, and behold our beauty, fashioned after the image of God, lying in the tomb, disfigured, dishonored, bereft of form. O marvel, what is this mystery which doth befall us? Why have we been given over to corruption, and why have we been wedded unto death? Truly, as it is written, by the command of God, who giveth the departed rest. What is this meditation? This meditation is on what happens to your body after it's put into the ground. We remember that. As we remember that, we remember the brevity of life. We remember what is valuable. Where does your treasure lie? Your treasure lies in your soul. Your treasure lies in your relationship to God, not in your body. Your body is going to turn into nothing, is going to dissolve away, but your soul is going to continue. And so it is that we pay attention to our soul and concern ourselves with the health of our soul. So it is that when we gather in a church to commemorate a person who has died, the best way to remember them is to remember our own soul, our own fleeting life, our own coming death, our own decay in the grave. And thus by doing this, we are able to somehow validate what they're going through, validate the experience that they're having by saying, the death of this person that I love has reminded me of the brevity of life, has reminded me of the eternal value of my soul and the changeableness, the decay that is my body. One more hymn. This is from the Beatitudes, which is another part of the Orthodox funeral that's sung. This is actually sung after the canon of St. John of Damascus. Each Beatitude is sung, and then after the Beatitude there's a hymn that's added in there. The Beatitude is, Blessed are ye when men shall revile you, and persecute you, and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my name's sake. Then listen to the hymn. Let us go forth and gaze into the tombs. Man is naked bones, food for the worms and stench. And we shall learn what are riches and comeliness and beauty and wealth. What is it that we have in this world? What is it that we most have that we can offer to God? And how is it that we build up the kingdom of heaven in this world? Not through our bodies, not through what we own, not through the way that we are able to influence the world around us to do whatever we want. Those things are important. It's important that we take care of ourselves. It's important that we seek to make our lives better by manipulating the world around us. Yes, those things are important, but there's something of inestimable worth, of more greater value. What is it that we are when we are laid in the tombs. We become bones. We become food for the worms and stench. What a thing to say during a funeral service, and yet what a wonderful thing to consider, that it is that this is the end of our lives, that this is what we are coming to, and that although we pay attention to the things of this world and try to make our lives as good as we can make them here, and the lives of the people around us as good as we can make them, still at the same time we pay attention to the eternal soul, to our lives, to the part of us that lives on. Well, we are coming to the end of our three-part series on the subject of death and heaven and hell, and I hope that you have well, perhaps not enjoyed, enjoy might not be the word, but certainly when we look at this subject, it's not always for enjoyment that we do so. I hope that perhaps you have gained something here. I hope that you realize that this is the end of our life, is death, and that no matter how successful we are in our lives, this is always going to be the end of us. We long most of all to seek God's mercy on our souls, to seek His forgiveness, to seek His help for us when we die. And this is why throughout our lives we learn to call out to Him for forgiveness and for mercy. This is the gift that He has given us. This is the grace that He has given us, so that we can experience communion with Him, not only here, but certainly for eternity when we go to live with Him.